Okay. Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Political Science Department at Prairie View A&M University's 2020 Election Town Hall. What happened and what's next? Uh, Today, we are joined by several esteemed panelists. And before we get started with any of the uh, subject matter for tonight, I ask each of the panelists to say hello and introduce themselves to our audience. Guess we could start with Melanie, or sorry, Dr.
Sure,
Price. Sorry.
that's fine. My name is Melanie Price. I'm an endowed professor of political science here at Prairie View. I'm also the director of the newly approved, we've made it through the approval process for the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice.
I don't know which direction it goes in, so I'll just go next. I'm Maia Young. I am a recent graduate of Prairie View A&M University. I graduated in May with my bachelor's in political science. So I love the poli-sci program. And yeah, that's pretty much everything. I was kind of like a co-chair with, we made, or like we were assisted by Dr. Price, Jayla, Allen, and I in our PV voting campaign, PV Votes 2020 for the October month. So yeah, I'll pass it to anybody.
All right, well, I guess I'll go. So my name is Anthony Nelson. I am a graduating senior. This is my last semester. So my major is political science, minor in behavioral sciences. And to piggyback off of a little what Maya said, well, we have an excellent political science department. So if anyone's interested in the major, definitely look into it. But yeah, I'm excited to be on this panel.
I'll go. Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Alexander III. I am a recent May graduate of the Prairie View A&M University, Team Wolfolk, as well, political science major, mass communications minor. I'm also a newly elected city councilman in the city of Prairie View, so I'm a city councilman elect. Thank you all to the people who voted for me. But I'm really looking forward to being a part of this panel and engaging about the importance of this election and kind of what happened and really digging in deeper into it. So thank you guys for having me.
Dr. Marshall, introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Dr. Michael Marshall. I am a assistant professor here at Prairie View A&M. This is my first semester, and I study comparative elections, political violence, and I am very happy to be here. And I'll introduce the other moderator, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Mitchell.
Hi, I'm Nathan Mitchell. I'm an expert in state politics, state and local politics, and so I'm happy to be here and talk about this really, really historic election. So
All right.
I'll be moderating the chat, so ask your questions and we'll get them in there.
Okay. So basically, the format for tonight's discussion, I'll provide a little. We'll have several topics. I'll provide a little bit of context, and then I'll ask a question, sometimes to all of the panel members, sometimes to specific panel members, and then the key here is we just want to have a discussion, try to keep it light and loose, and have a good time discussing this election and inform our audience members on the effects of this election system on future politics and the American democracy generally. So the first topic that we'll be going over tonight will be in reference to a recent tweet by Kamala Harris. Right. So recently, on November 9th, Kamala Harris, Madam Vice President-elect, said, "I want to speak directly to the Black women in our country. Thank you. You are too often overlooked and yet are asked time and again to step up and be the backbone of our democracy. We could not have done this without you." All right. So with this tweet, I wanted to ask the panel, what should the role of Black women be in the new administration? Who do you expect to facilitate the roles, um, eh, these important roles in the new administration? And I'll open it up to the panel.
I'm going to always let the students go first, and then, we can talk afterwards because I want to hear as much about what you guys think about the election, and it's a way of putting you on the spot. Yes.
All right, well, I guess I can start. So I think what we saw this election was the fact that Black women, as always, have stepped up and really just showed out, right? When we talk about American politics, when we talk about the electorate, we always talk about Black women. In a sense, Black women really are the moral compass of this nation. And when you look at this election, you look at how Black women showed up in places like Detroit, how they showed up in Atlanta, how they showed up in Milwaukee, Philadelphia, right? And in some ways to save our democracy, not to sound cliche, but that's just kind of how a lot of us feel. And I think 90% of Black women voted for Joe Biden, right? So I think it's important that Black women have a place on this ticket. They've earned it. They deserve it. It's way past due. But also that we support Black women, whether it's on the local level, the state level, the federal level, as they've been too far underrepresented in our politics, not listened to. I think having Kamala Harris is great on the ticket, but it just doesn't stop here, right? There's a lot more work to do. But I truly think this is a great time for Black women, and I'm just ecstatic about it.
So I guess I'll pick it up there. So just generally, Kamala Harris might have to go off to the vice president elect. She really just her being in that role, her being nominated to that position is an inspiration to millions of young girls who look just like her. I know my niece, for example, is not even 4 years old. And then when I was talking to her about the election and her seeing the vice president elect make her acceptance speech when she had just got sworn in, that was really a reflecting period. And it was also a time that I could identify with, is the same time as when Obama in 2008 did the same thing. And that really kind of put me in as far as like, he looks just like me. If he can do it, I can do it. So to see that he kind of relive into my niece, who's not even 4 years old, and kind of already see that, like, wow, just to see that representation, that's what really kind of hit me. But just like Anthony was saying, the Black women have really been the backbone, especially in the Democratic Party, for years after years, saving them election after election. It was the Alabama primary that won Doug Jones his seat. That was because of Black women. And like he was saying a while ago, in Philly, ATL, Detroit, these places where that originally Trump won in 2016 and Biden came out and flipped in 2020, that is predominantly due to the work of Black women. So I really feel like it's important to give Black women their props, their flowers, because they continue to save our democracy and continue to save this election, and election after election. They must have a role in a Biden administration. They must have a role. They must have an appearance and presence in this cabinet, as well throughout this whole administration, because that is what that is who America that is the Black women in America put him in office.
Yeah, I think I'll have to kind of piggyback and take kind of tidbits from both Anthony and Nathan's, just like what y'all said. But like whenever I think kind of like the election results came out about Biden and like the Harris ticket winning, I think like the first thing I thought of was, of course, Black women, but also like respecting Black women's work. And I think a lot of times you say like Black women, like for this election, save the democracy. And while that may be true, it's kind of like a bittersweet moment I think I have, because it's like, that's wonderful. And I'm so glad it happened. But I think it's kind of like a repeating and like habitual cycle that continues to happen. Like Black women continue to show up in these great numbers and really like try to advocate and organize in their community and mobilize. But like whenever the administration comes, wherever, like where are the Black women? Like where are they placed like representatively? And I think Kamala, while her being a Black woman in a very high position, like what does that mean for all the young Black women who are organizers, or like the young Black community leaders? Like what does that mean? So I think it's just kind of like it's like a really like awesome, like I love that for us, but like what now? Like now that we got you in office, now that we have you here, is the work of Black women going to continue to be celebrated and just like understood? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of you are right. I think it's important to point out that probably the most significant or the most famous forward Black women who we are talking about in this election, if you think about Kamala Harris, if you think about Stacey Abrams, even if you think about Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, who was an early endorser of Joe Biden, they're not just African American women, but they're HBCU educated African American women, right? And so it turns out that they are doing a significant amount of modeling that's particularly important. But look, it's not that Kamala Harris was on the ticket. It's that African American women demanded, they advocated both in the media and behind the scenes to ensure that there was a Black woman on that ticket, right? African American women tend to be one of the largest and sometimes the largest demographic that shows up, and they are incredibly loyal to the Democratic Party. And so because of that, people see it as truly important. But this time I heard Donna Brazile say somewhere that that African American women both changed the map in terms of what the map looked like for a Biden victory. They changed the math. That is, Stacey Abrams and others in Georgia, through their work of registering people to vote, literally increased the number of voters that Joe Biden could access in southern states, right? So they changed the map and the math. And so that's important because it means that they're not just sort of people who are out here advocating, they are strategists, they are fundraisers, they are doing absolutely all of the work to move into the height of their power. And I don't even think that we're there yet, right? We haven't seen that yet. This is sort of impolite to say, but we all know that traditionally the vice president is the presumptive nominee of the party, right? And so that means that when Joe Biden doesn't run anymore, Kamala Harris then becomes the presumptive nominee. And imagine what this will all look like when you have this Black woman at the top of the ticket. That you haven't seen Black women's power until you see that moment.
So
I also kind of want to just
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I also just want to kind of just piggyback off what Dr. Price said, and just that last part when she was saying just to think about how the vice president is the presumptive nominee, especially, and that's super important to think about in this election where we just elected the oldest president in the American history. Right. So although 4 years, that's what it seemed like, what is seeming likely for President-elect Biden. I just don't see an 8-year term being realistic just for his age, and right. So that gives us a lot of hope, and that gives us a lot of hope going into the next 4 years that we have someone already at the leading the race kind of for that race.
And I forgot to mention also that in terms of who goes into these spaces, I heard someone say recently that personnel is policy. That is, who you put in these agencies tells you a lot about what they expect them to do. And so the Biden administration announced its transition team and the leaders of its transition team this year so far. And we know that there are 11 African Americans on it. 7 of those African Americans are Black women. They make up about 30% of the committee. And so it'll be important for us to pay attention to what places African American women or African Americans in general end up, right? So if we just end up with a Secretary of HUD, that's like the traditional Black cabinet member. Like, then we know that it's like, that's disrespect. But they're already talking about Susan Rice as potential Secretary of State. Stacey Abrams can have whatever job in whatever place that she absolutely wants. Like, nobody can say anything to her right now. And so there are all of these women who are poised to actually take up serious positions as we go forward.
So, Dr. Price, you alluded to when Black women mobilize, when they participate, they change the map, they change the math. Very recently, Jim Clyburn, the sorry, the representative of the 6th District of South Carolina,
Mhm.
as well as Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, who just recently ran for Senate in South Carolina against Lindsey Graham, said, quote, "The Deep South is in play as long as Black women are mobilized." Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina all have substantial Black populations. In some cases, these are upwards of 30% of the population. So, in your view, is the South really in play, or is this a pipe dream of the Democratic Party?
I would also put Texas in there too, by the way, because it's a majority minority state, and increasingly so. Um, uh, we all know that famous quote from Lyndon Johnson when he signed the Voting Rights Act that the South would be lost to Democrats for a generation. We're about 2 generations in. But I think the thing that is crucial to say about that, especially in places like Georgia, Black people are actually sort of at the forefront of this. But what they've managed to do, what Stacey Abrams has done, is not just focus on registering Black people, but they have a strong registration game for Latinos, which is a burgeoning population across that part of the South, and Asian Americans and progressive whites. And so what they have done is created a voting coalition led by Blacks, particularly by African American women, but that is progressive and that includes other minority groups. And so it's important to note all of that. And that is a winning formula because it's always been the case that look, whites have never had the numbers necessarily in places like Mississippi. Mississippi should be blue, but it's not blue because white leaders in the state of Mississippi have manipulated the voting laws to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so now that you have people like Fair Fight going after the laws that we have, and if we, reinstate the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, if we actually make some of these infractions punishable, then you have the space for real Black power to be created in those spaces.
I want to kind of piggyback off that too. Me being from Louisiana, that's home, and I've seen some of like the voter suppression tactics that happen in states like that. Louisiana's Black population, I think, 4% of the total population. And we talk about the South being like Republican territory. It hasn't really been the case in Louisiana. I mean, even a few election cycles ago, we had, 2 Democratic U.S. senators. We had Mary Landrieu. Right now, it has a Democratic governor, right? So it's very of a disadvantage because of things like redistricting, in states like that. But when Black women lead, when Black people lead, when they do turn out, when there's a strong voter registration effort, then it's very much possible, right? So especially in Louisiana, when you have areas like New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Lafayette that have really strong Black populations that carry the state. If you turn out those voters in connection with, the white progressives, the growing Latino population in that state, then the states can be in play. Now, are they in play in the next 4 years? Not as much possible, but just like Georgia, it's a 6, 8, 10-year project, and it takes time. And I think when you lay that foundation and just keep working at it, even if you lose a few cycles, that's fine. But when you get to the point like Georgia did, then that's when you can say, okay, the efforts we put the last decade have worked. And I think that's where we have to start in Mississippi. Alabama elected Doug Jones not too long ago, right? And in places like Louisiana.
And
So
by the way, Doug Jones lost because he tried to retreat back to the right after those Black women got him elected. He didn't listen to them and he didn't stay with them. And then he lost, actually. And that's terrible for the Democratic Party, but that's should be a lesson learned for people who want to use the work of Black women to get into office and then not respect them when they get there.
But it seems like the party does that too often because either they get scared or they think, okay, I have the Black vote, let me retreat back to the right. And that's just not the case, right? We saw that last cycle in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, right? you have to turn out your core base of voters, and that involves Black voters, and particularly Black women. And if Black women aren't at the center of your get out the vote effort, then in places in the South and in the Midwest, you're just not going to win. So.
Before we move on real quick, we have a question in the Q&A. Will Dr. Price please explain how the voting laws have been manipulated in Mississippi? I think it's important for everyone to know exactly how this systemic racism works so that we won't be accused of spewing misinformation.
Okay, sure. I think there's always a chance you'll be accused of spewing misinformation anyway, but let's go. So in 2013, Shelby v. Holder, which was a Supreme Court case, essentially ended all of the most important powers of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation for African Americans since emancipation, which isn't a piece of legislation, but you get my point. There was the Emancipation Proclamation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 actually helped to try to finish that job. And so it brought African Americans into voting. But what it also did was it made it impossible for Southern states to use racially discriminatory practices like literacy tests, like understanding clauses, like the grandfather clause, like the white primary, which was undone in Texas by a Prairie View grad, right? And so the Voting Rights Act made it impossible to do those things. And what that meant was then you had a large share of African Americans gaining elective office across the South. It is true that to this day, Mississippi has the largest number of African American elected officials. And that's because the Black population is so great there. And so what these Southern states then go to the Supreme Court and do is say, look, Black people vote at the same level as white people in the South. And so you're just punishing us for something that happened in the civil rights movement, and we have moved on past that. And this conservative Supreme Court agrees with that. And what they do is Ruth Bader Ginsburg essentially says that taking away the Voting Rights Act is essentially getting rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're no longer getting wet. It's like you're taking away the thing that protects you from actually feeling the damage, right? And so immediately, literally the day after the Shelby decision, states like Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, they require you to have state issued IDs. They shorten early voting periods. They allow people to change voting locations, voting machines. All of that used to have to be cleared through the Department of Justice. Now they can do any of those things. And so what it has done is it has taken away the ability of individuals to sue on behalf of racial discrimination prior to actual voting days, which is why you saw in this election where, in places like Harris County, in places like Waller County, where we are litigating 2018 right now. And it's not like if the courts say, well, in 2018, you should have given the students early voting hours. We can go find all those students who would register to vote. We can unseat the people who were elected who might not, who maybe weren't supposed to be. And it's those kinds of laws that we have to stop allowing states to do. Because look, there has never been a time since 1965 that white election officials in some of these counties stopped trying to prevent Black people from voting. It's just that the Voting Rights Act was the buffer between them and voter suppression. All that you can look up. The Prairie View case is Sims v. US. You can also look up Smith v. Allwright. Smith was a Prairie View graduate. You can also look up probably, Allen v. Waller County?
Allen v. Waller.
Yeah, Allen v. Waller.
That's the 2018.
Allen v. Waller.
Yeah, Allen v. Waller. That's the 2018 case. You can look up all of those things.
All right, so we have a question from our Q&A section. Kind of goes hand in hand with what we're talking about here. Biden won more votes in Texas in 2020 than Trump did in 2016 and still lost Texas. What does this mean? And I guess to go along with this too, a question to piggyback for our councilman-elect is what are some of the challenges that you have encountered as a pub as someone sorry, what are some of the challenges that you have encountered running for public office here in Texas?
For sure. So what I would say, let me just to answer that question. Trump definitely, Biden definitely secured more votes in 2020 than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And also in 2018, Beto O'Rourke also narrowed down margin as well. So just like Anthony was saying a while ago, we might not win. It may take a couple of election cycles, but we're coming. We're coming and we're moving. And those numbers alone should scare Republicans greatly, deeply. They should definitely scare Republicans deeply, especially the governor of Texas, whose gubernatorial seat is up in 2022. So it's just the fact of mobilization and us getting out there and really making us our mark in the state of Texas. I know running for city council, and Maia is on here as well, who started as my campaign chair. She can tell you that, there was multiple times that I called her and just kind of ranting of just like the different roadblocks and different things that kind of go up in your way, even before you even take the oath of office, to try to bring you down. But at the end of the day, the will of the people and the will of the voters in this democracy is what counts. So I feel like it's really important that from a local level, from a county level, from a state level, all the way up to the president of the United States, that we are honoring the will of the people, and we are putting them into we are choosing them. We are choosing the people that they chose to represent. So I feel like those are some of the things that I've just been running into running for city council in the city of Prairie View, and also dealing with like the older the older generation as well, kind of questioning my tactics or necessarily my intentions for the city. That's also been a big thing through the campaign. But I'm here to represent all people in the city of Prairie View, both students and lifelong residents. I look forward to doing that during my term.
Like Nathan said, I helped with the campaign a little bit, and I wasn't running, but Nathan definitely did call me a couple times to rant. But I would say like the problems that I think we face a lot, that we've been facing since I think Nathan and I have gotten to Prairie View. I got there in 2017, he got there in 2016, was just like the accessibility problem. And so like we really tried to help with that. I think like we really focus mostly on like grassroots the best way we can in Prairie View and Waller County, which is just like door busting or we always told like the campaign, we have to meet people where they are kind of. So just kind of going to them and really like advocating on their behalf in every situation. So whether it's to the county or like to the city officials who are elected now, like just kind of being there. But I also think like voter education was really important, because I think even though like I know for me, I was a first time voter when I got to the campus of Prairie View, and I voted in the 2018 election, but that was when we only had like 3 days of early voting on campus within the second week. And so there were so many like voter intimidation and suppression laws that kind of like deterred me from even voting in the first place. But then kind of like letting students know and other people know that like Texas has these very strict voting laws that is not the same across the country. But so just kind of preparing them. So I would just say like voter education was our biggest thing to do. And I think that's what's also fueled just kind of like the national election as well. It's just like telling people and educating them in the best way, like how to vote, where to vote, and why to vote, especially.
And the demographics of Texas are changing, right? And changing very fast. Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, right? And it just happens that this cycle, like the previous ones, the rule vote kind of helped the Republicans a little bit. And that's all right. We have to keep fighting. It's not like we're just going to stop fighting this cycle because we lost. Yeah, we did win more votes, but it just wasn't enough. I think Democrats looked at this and saw that we lost a little inroads with certain communities, particularly I think the Latino community in the southern part of Texas. So we maybe have to look at messaging. But overall, I'm still pretty much optimistic that Texas can turn, if not blue, a shade of purple. And not the cycle, that's fine. You know, a lot of people, you know, had the hope, and I did a little bit too, but I was still kind of a little unsure in the back of my mind. But the work continues as long as, you know, we continue fighting, we continue organizing, we continue protesting, we continue educating voters and having events like this that, you know, get people informed about the process. Then yeah, I mean, it might happen next cycle. I mean, look at what happened in Georgia, right? I mean, how Georgia had a huge turnout and turned, I mean, blue. No one expected that. I know I didn't, right? It came out of nowhere. But I mean, that can happen to Texas next cycle as well. So we just got to keep pushing forward and organizing, and you know, hopefully we'll get there.
I think it's important to note that Stacey Abrams started her work around 2011, 2012. And when she was saying she was going to turn Georgia blue, people laughed. They were like, this is ridiculous. And it was kind of a lark that people thought probably wouldn't happen, because how in the world could these Confederate states turn blue? We are at a tipping point here. And even though it didn't happen in Texas, and even though it didn't happen in this election, then it might happen right on time, right? That is, in a non-presidential election, right when it's time to change leadership in the state. And then there's a chance that changing leadership in the state helps get rid of some of the voter suppression tactics. And then you can turn it blue in a presidential election. I mean, that's the way I think. I mean, I was hoping it would happen this time, but I think that's probably a more likely scenario. Demographics are not on the side of Republicans, not because inherently people are just, you're not born Republican or Democratic, but it's because they are not persuading people of color. And it's not just that people of color are everywhere. The most important thing to focus on is, if you look at the young vote, people of color are overrepresented among the young, right? And so for instance, look at the election returns of people of color. And if you look, I mean, the election returns of young people, if you look at it, it looks like 65% or so of them went for Biden. And you go, oh, see, young people, they're more liberal, they're leftist, whatever. But if you break it down by race, that's not true for young white voters. They actually voted for Trump. I mean, this election polling stuff is kind of wonky, but it looks like they preferred Trump over Biden, which means that young people of color are pushing that support for the Democratic Party. And so that bodes well for the future for Democrats. And it should be troubling for Republicans, who are going to have to figure out how to get more people of color on their side. And one of the ways that it's going to help them is having Trump out of office, because you can't just roll down an escalator and announce that Mexicans are rapists and then think they're going to vote for you. You just can't.
Although some have.
But also, let me just say this, because you mentioned the polls. These polls this cycle, they were very wrong before the election. Everybody knew they were out of whack. They have adjusted the election national exit polls twice. And so first, now it looks like 79% of Black men, for instance, voted for Biden, which means 21% voted for Trump. Turns out that no other surveys have that number. They have more like 85% Biden and less than that. And so we need to be very careful about what happened with Latinos. What happened in South Florida was expected. Cubans vote Republican.
Yeah.
Venezuelans, white identified Cubans vote Republican. Venezuelans, people from Nicaragua, they have their own history with communism that was being tapped into by the Republican Party. And so they were doing something very specific. If you look at Puerto Ricans, if you look at Mexicans, which are much larger part of the Latinx community, then they actually did what we thought Latinos would do, which is support the Democratic Party. And how much they did, I wouldn't take most of those exit polls too seriously yet. They will adjust them again probably in a few weeks. It will still mean that probably by a couple of percentage points, more Black women, more Black men, more Latinx men and women voted for Trump. I don't know what to make of that, but I do know that it won't be as large as we are seeing right
All right, I'm going to get Dr. Jones in on this conversation. In an extension to this, Jim Clyburn and Jamie Harrison also attributed more progressive calls, such as defund the police, with Democratic losses in down ballot tickets. So, does Black Lives Matter have a public relations problem? Does it have a messaging problem? And how should Black Lives Matter move forward in order to expand the electorate and maximize its power in politics?
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. I have been just enjoying listening to this conversation. Right now, I think there is a debate amongst the Democratic leadership as to just how we need to proceed forward. I think it was Mr. Nelson who talked about the fact that we might need to work on our messaging strategy. I think that in some places, the slogan defund the police did hurt particular candidates. That seemed to be particularly prevalent in with those candidates who had flipped a Republican seat in the 18 election, and it went back Republican in 20. But I don't think Black Lives Matter has a public relations problem. I think that overall, their strategy has been very effective. I think they have been able to marshal large swaths of the American electorate, have been able to persuade them that racial justice issues, police brutality issues are all issues that we as a nation have to address. As I tell my students often, when you talk about issues of race, that's very divisive. But when you're talking about America, you cannot ignore issues of race. This goes all the way back to the founding of our country. And so I think the messaging, the way we message, and we have to do more target messaging, I think was really what was more so the problem. I also think that it's generational. I think that defund the police means one thing to the older generation than it means to the younger generation. I don't think there's anybody in our country that thinks we need to eliminate the police altogether. However, I think there is a large consensus that there certainly needs to be some reform. Historically, we know how the police got started, and their initial motivations were certainly not just to protect and serve. So I think that has to be a conversation that the nation has. And I think that we will have that conversation with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris as a part of the administrative leadership team, particularly with her background in law enforcement. And also the fact that as the Attorney General in California, she did put in place many innovative programs that many other states have begun to look at to try to begin to solve some of the problems that we have had when it comes to issues of police brutality, when it comes to issues of criminal justice reform. So I fully support Black Lives Matter. I support their goals, but I think, as with anything, messaging is critical, but more so targeted messaging, because I just don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. And Dr. Marshall, if you will allow me, I just want to make a comment about the numbers in Texas. I think what we saw was really excellent for Texas. I've lived in Texas when Texas was blue. I think we have the numbers to make Texas blue. But I think that we have not had the organizing strategies in place or the messaging to convince people that they need to vote. We know that Texas has been at the bottom when it comes to eligible voters actually going out to vote. We've been number 50 of the 50 states. And so I think with organizations like Beto O'Rourke's organization in terms of trying to register and educate the Texas electorate why they need to participate, Stacey Abrams with Fair Fight, and a few other organizations, I think that it will not be long before we actually are able to reflip Texas back to a blue state. And also, I just want to congratulate Mr. Alexander, one of my former students, for actually getting in the arena. You know, I think that we need more young people to actually step out on faith and try to become involved, because every generation has an obligation to pass the baton to that next generation of leaders to move us forward. And I think particularly for African Americans, that is what has happened. You know, each generation reaches back, trains that next generation for leadership. And so I think that within the next couple of cycles, with people like Mr. Alexander and Dr. Rollins and Prairie View assuming leadership positions, you know, I think that we're going to see some things happen a little differently.
I mean, I think it's important to point out, Dr. Young Jones, you're absolutely right that, you know, our students are actually quite unique in their level of knowledge, their level of participation, their level of activism around voting rights. It is actually one of our most important characteristics of our undergraduate education here. There are very few people Nathan's age or Maia's age who can say, I ran a successful campaign, I chaired a campaign of someone who was successful, you know, who can say I was a precinct judge, who understands the ins and outs of misinformation, who has worked to get out the vote and mobilize voters. Literally, they could parlay that into doing amazing work on larger and larger and larger campaigns. And so there is no reason why Maia couldn't become the next Donna Brazile, right? Who was the first
Absolutely.
African-American woman to run a presidential campaign that was won in the votes, but not by the courts. That's important to point out, right?
That's right.
There's no reason why she couldn't go on to do that. There's no reason why we could see Nathan not running for governor, right? It sounds like Anthony would be in there somewhere strategizing too. And so our kids, the unfortunate activity of the county really gives our students the opportunity to use their undergraduate experience as a political lab where they are learning skills that can take them all sorts of places throughout the political world. And it's really commendable. And when you tell other people about it, they just cannot believe it. I'm telling you, it's important.
Absolutely.
I just want to just kind of first thank you again, Dr. Jones, so much. Thank you for all the wisdom you shared upon me during my time at Prairie View. But just I just want to go to the to the question of the Black Lives Matter have a messaging problem and things of that nature. First, I want to say that Black Lives Matter should not be a partisan issue. It just shouldn't. It should not be a partisan issue because these are actual people's lives who are endangered at this point. So I really feel like it should transcend party. It really should transcend party. I also feel like defund the messaging around defund police. I feel like there was a two different narratives, and two different narratives, and people kind of ran with the narrative they felt like best suited what they thought the agenda was. But when I hear or think of defunding the police, I'm more thinking of a reallocation of resources that are in the police department. For example, I don't believe that police officers should respond to armed police officers should respond to every situation. There's some situations that I feel like social workers should be responding to, because a lot of these police officers don't know how to bring tensions down, and they escalate instead of mediate. So I really feel like a lot of these situations can be avoided if we have proper people responding to these different calls. So that's and that's also a reallocation on the city level. So that's like people like me in city council, kind of looking at where the money is going into the police department and exactly what is it doing. So I really feel like it's important that people from the local governments all across the nation kind of look at what the police department is spending on, and what resources can be allocated differently to enhance the citizens of the community. And I also want to say, I do not believe that no candidate, in the United States Congress ran on defunding the police. Like, no candidate in the United States Congress ran on defunding the police. So when you look kind of just generally overall in the whole campaign structure, you want to kind of look under the hood. And what I see is that a lot of these candidates, especially Democratic candidates, they are still campaigning like it's 2005. It's 2020. And a lot of them didn't even have a digital organizing method in the middle of a pandemic. So when you look at that, I feel like that's also a crucial factor to kind of weigh in into the 2020 election results, that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and a lot of these candidates did not have a successful or are catching digital organizing message. Like Maya said, you got to meet the voters where they are.
I think too.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And I was going to say, I think too, we have to stop allowing the Republicans to label us, because one thing I always say is Democrats sometimes are just really terrible at messaging, because we have such a diverse party. Like, we're the Big Ten party. We literally have party of conservatives, moderates, liberals. I mean, that's just our party. It always will be. So we have to look at what message we use in different districts. And we also, as everyone said, we have to focus on the right targeting the right voters. But I think we have to understand that the fights we're having in the party, they aren't necessarily a bad thing. Now, the fact that they're in the press so much can be distracting, but, and I always tell people that, when we have to explain what a message means, then we're already losing that battle, right? If we have to explain what defunding the police actually means, then we're already losing. Because to some people, they mean different things. Like, we're coming at it from a policy, perspective, from academic perspective, but some people don't see it that way. When they see sloganeering, when they see something that says defund the police, those voters assume that's what you want to do. So if we're having to tell people no, it just means reallocating resources, then we've lost that battle already.
It's important too, I think. Oh, I'm sorry, Maya, do you want to go? It's important too, I think, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's not just to focus on defund the police. That's actually sort of a small subset of the kinds of ways that they have been innovative in terms of electoral politics. And so if you look at, I think, the most important innovation that Black Lives Matter has made is they have made in urban spaces district attorney races actually competitive. And so it used to be that district attorneys would run for office, they would get elected, and they would be there forever because people barely paid attention to the fact that that it was an elected office in the first place. And when these district attorneys refused to indict police officers and just regular vigilante citizens for shooting Black people, BLM had the vision to say, oh, we can get you out of office. And they did it in places like Chicago and Cleveland and Philadelphia, and in this election cycle in Los Angeles. And so they are making huge inroads in changing the structures of local governments. And that is the place where their legacy will be, I think, felt the most, because oftentimes people don't pay attention to the fact that in places like Texas, judges are elected. They are elected in the same way that they are elected. When you stand in front of them, if they are not doing things that feel like things that should be done, then it is incumbent upon you to make sure that they lose their seats. And Black Lives Matter has been focused on that all around the country, and they have been very successful in putting district attorneys in office who refuse to indict people on low-level drug charges, who are trying to end bail for certain kinds of fines. I mean, who are making bail free, who are freeing people without bail, who are doing all kinds of things that are important for the African American community. And so people try to focus on stuff like defund the police because they believe it's going to scare white voters. In the same way that they were also somehow able to convince them that Black Lives Matter and other groups were going to try to dismantle the suburbs. Right?
That's kind of another thing too. Like when, people on the other side, when you think about Black voters, they automatically go to like law and order issues, right? Police issues, and those are important. Bail reform, having an equitable criminal justice system, those are important. But we also care about education, right? We also care about healthcare. We also care about infant mortality rates, about poverty, about unemployment. Like we are Americans too. Like we care about the issues that every other American cares about. And I want people to understand that when you talk about our community, when you want to focus on getting out the vote for our community, you need to do more than just talk about police reform. Like that's important, but I want to know, how are we going to get more Black Americans employed? How are we going to reinvest in public education? How are we going to, reinvest in Black communities? How are we going to support HBCUs? Like we want those issues addressed as well.
So we have a great, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut anyone else off.
I was just gonna continue the conversation with, or just like a finishing up, because when I think like Black Lives Matter and the movement, its messaging, the first thing I think of is young people. I think especially we live in this very social media and like digital age where I think whenever BLM started, it was more of a very active movement. It focused like mostly on organizing and mobilizing, but then there was the hashtags, and then there were social media posts and different things just being spread amongst like a number of people. And so I think I don't think it's a messaging problem. I think it's just more of, like it's been mentioned before, just like the targeting of that messaging and what it means. And then with the whole defund the police thing, I've always thought it's very interesting when people focus on that, especially like knowing where it's coming from, because I think they just kind of fail to acknowledge and just be grossly ignorant to the fact that the police in certain communities have been very, very harsh and just very, in other words, like racist and very harsh. And so when I say defund the police, it's not like I don't know, it's not saying that like I want to take it away, but like understand what the police have done to people who look like me for years in this country and why I feel this way about it. And just like, and then I think like them condemning Black Lives Matter and like defund the police, it just makes me want to say it even more. Like your anger is like, you're proving me right in the sense, like this is why I want to really reallocate these resources or keep fighting or keep organizing my community, because I shouldn't have to prove to you that my life matters. I think me being here is a proving them more, but also I think Black lives more than matter. I think matter is the minimum. So like I matter, but then what? I matter, but how? I matter, but why? And then continuing that, and then you acknowledging that and realizing that in every single space.
So we have a great question in the Q&A section. As an institutionalist, this gets me going. The issue of the candidates during this election has been proven to be very unorganized and controversial, with many expressing that neither candidate was a great fit. However, Biden being the better of the options among some voters. Do you believe that situations such as the political debates could express a type of all right, so I think what the person is trying to say is, are there certain types of institutional changes, reforms, constitutional amendments in the way that we run elections, the way that we control our executives, that should be done? The last 4 years, as well as this 2020 election, have frequently brought to light clear institutional ambiguities. So for each one of you, I would like to hear, what is a fundamental institutional reform that you think needs to be done in order to preserve American democracy or expand it?
So I thought I had an answer, but I didn't see the question.
That was a very good question.
So I defer to them.
I was gonna say, I don't know if I can think of one thing. Even when I think of American democracy, I think my thought of that is very I don't know, because like democracy for who? And then I think of like the founding of this country that was mentioned. And I think the founding of this country was very problematic to begin with. Freedom and justice for all. And then you go back and you have like these enslaved people at your house. It's a little weird. But I don't know. I think whenever I think of like candidates, I don't know if I'm naive to think that there is someone out there who is very unproblematic and who wants all of these things that are not kind of like a bargaining point or like a partisan issue, like things that are just kind of basic human right, like necessities, and that it transcends, like Nathan said, party. I don't know if I'm naive to think that, but I think it's possible. I don't know if I've seen it in anything, but I also think of how we see, or like how jobs are, I guess, in like this democracy, like in like what does it mean to be president and what does that job entail? Because I feel like it's like, what are you perpetuating? Is it very like evil inherently? Is it like, what do you have to do to be president? Like, what does that mean? And can anybody do that? In what way? So I don't know if there's like one specific, like one just thing that'll just be like a fix it. I don't know if that exists. I think it's more of like a person part and like a reform issue. I don't know.
I definitely agree with Maya. Because when I think of America, just just in general, I'm thinking like not to mention like militarism and imperialism. But I'm just thinking just like generally like what Maya said, like a constitution that was created for the people by the people, like yet we go home and have people enslaved. But just overall speaking, if there are a lot of systematic problems just within our government that I feel like that are roadblockers that date back to the Jim Crow, and even back to slavery. Some of the things I can even think about just off the top of my head is, for example, like the filibuster rule in the Senate. That was a Jim Crow era rule. And also when I think about it, I also think about the Electoral College as well. That dates all the way back to when Black people were considered 3/5 of a person. So when I think about those two off tops, I feel like those are the two important things to me, because I feel like it really undermines the representation of every voice and every vote matters in America. When basically you can win by 5 million people, yet the Electoral College can say you're not the winner. And that's a problem. And we'll see if that happens this year in January 20th. But, it just sets you up for, the fact that, for example, here we are in an election as we speak right now. And, we're waiting, the people have already decided. Now the Electoral College is going to meet. The Electoral College could literally go rogue. Like, they don't have to honor what we want them to do. And what they decide, that's the official results. That's crazy. That's crazy. So some stuff like that, I feel like, we're in America. It's the 21st century. Let's kind of update and build better. And also when I go to a state, I just want to touch on a state, the state issue as well, because I'm also a states person, a local person. And when I think of like state and here in locally in state, I think of the state of Texas. I mean, how they only work for like 120 days when they first get elected. So literally, and they only work for 120 days, and then they do whatever for the rest of their term, for the rest of the year and a half of their term. So, that's something that I feel like should be changed to kind of begin working for all the people.
I think one of the things that we could do is we need to re-examine money in politics. I think these races are getting out of hand when it comes to dollars. I think all this dark money in politics needs to go. We can look around the world and see that there are different ways to do things. And so what I am hoping is that the younger generation, the Miss Youngs and the Mr. Alexanders and the Mr. Nelsons, will reimagine how we can do elections in the future, because I do think a lot of good people are discouraged from running for office because the cost is so high. And I'm with Mr. Alexander. I think the time for the Electoral College has come and gone. The Electoral College was basically put in by white men to keep other white men that they thought were ignorant from being able to select a president. And so I think the time for that is over. If we truly mean one man, one vote, then then the Electoral College is not necessary.
And I want to touch on those, first starting with the money, because, I ran for city council in Houston last year. And of course, I didn't win my race. But one of the things I hated was I had to go to like special interest groups and basically beg them for money because it's so expensive to run a campaign. And even a city, the size of Houston, it was expensive. I literally needed, close to 6 figures to run my campaign. And I came nowhere near that. Because there are people who have money who can just throw money at their campaigns, or there are people who have money who can just easily write you a $5,000 or $10,000 check, right? I tried to focus my campaign on being more grassroots, but I mean, there's just so much money in politics, and people throw money on top of money, right? And then touching on the Electoral College, just imagine, Nathan, in your race, someone got more votes than you, and you still lost, right? I'm sorry, you got more votes than someone else and you still lost, right? That wouldn't seem fair. And to me, we really have to look at how we run our elections, and we have to go to the popular vote because land does not vote, right? We know the history behind the Electoral College. We know how it's not fair. How can you get 5 million more votes, or even 2016, how can you get 3 million more votes and still lose the election, right? It's the only place in the world I've ever seen something like that happen. And then on my last point is I really think we need a structural change when it comes to Congress in a way that they don't seem independent anymore, right? You look at the Republicans these last couple of years, and they've done every single thing that Donald Trump has wanted them to do, right? If we are going to have a separation of our branches of government, then we need a Congress that's at least more independent of the executive, and we don't have that right now. And I think that's a problem for our democracy when the person at the top has way too much power.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo some of that. I'll say that the first thing that came to mind is I think it should be required that we should now make it a law and not a custom that the person who sits in the presidency must divest themselves from their economic interests. It turns out that seemed like a pretty clear, obvious, but it wasn't. And so we should make that a rule so that you don't enrich yourself by this office, because when you leave the presidency, they make a ton of money. And so they can get it when they go, but not when they're there. I think we need to do more work on systematizing voter registration rolls and encouraging states to use more uniform processes and to discourage voter purges. So for instance, I think there should be some kind of law that says that you have a right not to show up for elections. And that doesn't mean that your name gets purged from the rolls, right? I mean, once you're registered to vote, you should be registered for the rest of your life. If you don't move, if you don't change states, if you don't do any of that stuff. And so I think we're gonna have to do lots more legislation around that, more issues related to ethics, and more issues really related to money. And those are the things that I think systematically we'll have to do.
All right. Well, sadly, we have to leave it there for tonight. This was the town hall of the election 2020. What happened and what is next? And this was brought to you by the Political Science Department at Prairie View A&M University. Thank you very much to all of our panelists and to our attendees for some great questions. And I hope everyone has a great night. And yeah, great work.
Great job, everyone.
Good night.
That was awesome.
Thank you
Good
guys.
night, everybody.
Great night. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. This is pretty great.
Ariana, I look forward to getting the recording.
Alrighty, no problem.
Hope I did okay.
Yes, everything was great. Good job.
Thank you.
And I'll go ahead and end it now.
Okay.
Okay.